Have you ever wondered how to make your dialogue really stand out and be really audible and easy to understand above all the other sounds in your film without making it sound weird or unnatural? Well, this video is going to go into all the things you need to do just that. So originally this video was just going to be how to compress dialogue. But as I was starting to put together the video, what I realized was there's so much more to doing this type of thing than just compression. And it's about leveling through a bunch of different methods. And we're going to go through a bunch of different methods, but it's not just about those kind of dynamic range controls. We'll talk about what that means in a second. But really what I want to go into in this video is kind of a in-depth look at what it takes to, again, make your dialogue clear, stand out, be audible, and to hit the technical requirements of certain distributors. So let's go ahead and go in here and look at this project I have. Now this project is a project that was shot, I believe, by a company called CineSpot, and it was originally done for a competition, video editing competition. This is just a short scene from it. I'll link the full file set in the description so you can download and mix this yourself if you want to. Or edit this yourself rather, and this scene is a part of that. It's a bit cheesy, it's a bit awkward, but I figured better to use something like this than to make you listen to me talking about mixing my own voice. Now I will point out a few of these sound effects are actually pulled from my Patreon. So I have a Patreon where I post bonus content for some of my videos. You get early access to my videos, and you also get if you support at the sound effects tier, you get a certain number of sound effects every month. So a couple of these sound effects, this ambience here, these two ambiences actually are both available through there. So if you want to download these and a bunch of other sound effects that I've released on there, you can do that. This construction recording I haven't released. It hasn't fit into any set of sounds that I've released yet, so I haven't released that yet. And then I also did some footsteps and some water coloring fully. So those are synced to the picture, so it would make sense to release those. I guess, you know what, I'll go ahead and release them. So I'll make a bonus content for this video, and I'll put that Foley in there. So if you want to mix this scene yourself, you can use the Foley that I recorded if you really want to. It's not the best, but I'll put it on there. But let's go ahead and let's just watch through the scene and see kind of what we're dealing with.
Hey, I just had the weirdest dream ever. I was in a warehouse and there was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away no matter what. Like every time I turned around, he was just right there. And he had this axe, and we went up these stairs and he was right there, and as soon as I turned around, he just tried to get me and then I woke up. Wow, it's awful. This is scary. You need this one.
Okay, so this scene is a little cheesy, like I said, but there's a lot of background noise right now. Now this is an excessive amount of background noise. I've got some room tone here, I've got kind of a morning sounds of birds chirping outside, and then I also have some sounds of construction going on outside. Now, if I was mixing the scene for real, I would probably not add the construction sounds unless there was like some plot point in this film that there was construction going on next door. It wouldn't really make sense to add the super loud construction sounds in this scene. But I added it just because I want to make this scene very loud and noisy to kind of demonstrate as we go through mixing our dialogue, the techniques we use to bring it up will be a bit more obvious. You can see the dialogue is getting almost buried behind that background noise, so as we do all the things we're going to do to it, that will bring it out of that background noise and make it really audible and clear, even with, again, the excessive amount of background noise. Now, if you look in the session here, the first thing that I have, and I've already loaded up a couple of things on my two dialogue channels, the first thing is this denoiser. Now this denoiser is not doing much. You can see here it's only doing 2.8 dB of noise reduction. But I have this here only to point out that if you need to do any kind of repair on your dialogue, you should do that first. So if your dialogue was recorded too hot and it's clipping, Maybe there's some rustling sounds. Maybe there's too much reverb, too much noise. Whatever it is, fix that first. And that should be the first thing you do before any other processing. Now, denoising is really common. It's probably the most common type of repair you'll have to do on dialogue. But I want to point out that you do not want to go too heavy-handed with it. There's some really great tools out there. Voice denoise by Isotope is really great. There's some really great tools out there by Waves and Acusonos and others that are really great at just eliminating all of the noise from a dialogue track. But just because you can do that doesn't mean you should, and in fact you should not do that. The reason is that noise is somewhat natural. It's kind of just a part of everything. There's always a bit of noise present, and that's why we add in noise. But you don't need to purge all of the noise from your dialogue track, because the noise in the dialogue, while you don't want it to be excessive, a little bit of noise can help make the dialogue sound more natural, and it can even make it sound, it can help give you a sense of the size of the space. So different room tones can reflect different spaces where the dialogue was originally recorded. So having just a tiny bit of that noise can help kind of subconsciously ground the dialogue in the place where it was recorded. Now, again, you don't want excessive noise, but again, purging all of the noise is not generally a good idea. And also, excessive denoising typically sounds bad. You'll start to get digital artifacts. It'll start to sound nasty. So don't worry about purging all of the noise from your dialogue. If there's excessive noise, reduce it, but reduce it just to the point where it's not distracting. Don't purge it from the dialogue track. Now, the next thing I have here is this Nectar. This is a vocal tool created by Isotope. What I have it doing right now is just a bit of EQ. So I have this EQ just reducing a couple unwanted resonances, and then I've got this broader EQ just kind of shaping the overall tone. I have a whole video on EQing vocals, so if you want to learn more about how to EQ dialogue and vocals, I'd recommend going to watch that video. The only thing I'll point out, because I don't think I talked about in that video, is I have this high cut here. If you come from mixing music, for example, this probably seems like a crazy thing to do, but it's actually not too uncommon for dialogue. Maybe a bit controversial, but not too uncommon. And the reason is that there's just not much up there. Most adults can't hear past about 15K, and we're only losing about an octave, and not even completely losing it. We're just gently sloping off the upper octave of our hearing. And this just helps to cut down on excessive noise. It helps to cut down on sibilance, which we'll talk about in a second. So it just kind of tames the overall brightness. Yes, it does make the dialogue less bright, but that's not as critical for movie dialogue. If you're mixing music, you generally want your vocals to be really, really bright, because it helps them cut through all of the other instruments. But dialogue in a movie doesn't have to compete with things like cymbals and honestly, cymbals are the big thing as far as high end goes, but it doesn't have to compete with stuff like that. So you can cut a bit of that high end and still have the dialogue cut through just fine. So it's just a little bit of a way to cut down a bit of that really high end noise and sibilance and stuff. So what is sibilance? Sibilance is the sounds, S's, T's, and other consonant sounds can have a bit of that too, but it's this very high frequency energy, and it can become a bit excessive. A lot of microphones used for recording dialogue, especially condenser microphones, can kind of excessively bring out that sibilance, and as a result, it has to be tamed. And the way it's tamed is with something called a de-esser. So let's just listen to a section of this dialogue really quick.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an
So you can hear that sibilance is coming out way more than all of the rest of what she's saying. So we're going to enable this de-esser, and we've got a threshold here. And this de-esser is basically a multi-band compressor. So it's a compressor in that it's going to react to the sound and bring it down when it gets above a certain threshold, but it's only going to do that in the frequency range where the sibilance is present. So let's play this back really quick.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was like
So you can see we're reducing the sibilance by about 5 to 7 dB on average. That's quite a bit of reduction, but you can hear it brings those S sounds down quite a bit and makes them a lot tamer and more tolerable.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was...
Honestly, it's still pretty sibilant. Sometimes a dialogue editor's approach to this will be to add a second de-esser. This Nectar de-esser, I like it because it's very kind of smooth and slow, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a bit more transparent than other de-essers, but it does also, as you start to use it more heavily, it becomes more obvious. So a lot of times I'll pair it with a different de-esser. This isn't uncommon for dialogue mixing in general, is to use multiple de-essers in series to bring down the S's. Some dialogue mixers also like to do it manually, so they'll actually go in and zoom in, find the S's, and just manually turn them down individually. That is a bit excessive, but you can do that. But again, you do want to tame those S's. I will point out, if you only focus on the S's in a dialogue, all of the S's will sound too loud. You really do have to kind of step back and listen to the dialogue as a whole to determine if the S's are actually distracting, because otherwise you'll sit there all day trying to completely remove the S's. So you do want to do a bit of reduction, generally speaking, but make sure to listen in context and don't focus on just the S's as you're removing them. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to bring in our compressor. So I'm going to use the Neutron 3 compressor. This is another tool by Isotope. You can use any compressor, but I like this one. I have a whole video on compression if you don't know what compression is or you want to learn more about how compression works. But the short explanation is compression is a way of automatically reducing the volume of something. Basically, you have a threshold. The sound goes above that threshold. The compressor automatically turns the sound down based on the ratio of the compressor. So it's a great way to just kind of overall even out and level the audio. So to set our compressor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank up my ratio a whole bunch, and I'm going to bring down my threshold a bunch, and we're going to play and we're going to listen to this.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away no matter what, like every time.
Okay, so this sounds pretty decent. Now, our attack and release here are pretty good. Attack and release can vary compressor to compressor, but generally I found a 20 millisecond attack and a 100 millisecond release is a good starting point. 20 milliseconds of attack on one compressor might be different from 20 milliseconds of attack on a different compressor, so you can't just copy and paste attack and release settings from one compressor to the other and expect them to sound the same, because they might not. But generally, in the neighborhood of 20 milliseconds of attack, 20 milliseconds of release is what you want to go for. Now, what you want to focus on, because what you want to avoid, is distortion and pumping. So, to give you an example of what that sounds like, I'm just going to bring my attack and release really short.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he...
So you can hear when we have that super, super short attack and release, we're just destroying the audio. It sounds super distorted and garbled and terrible. That's because that really fast attack and release starts to act more like a hard clipper than a compressor. It's just reacting so fast that it ends up distorting the audio. So we don't want that. So we do want, again, at least about 20 milliseconds of attack. And sometimes even at that level of attack, you can get a bit of distortion. So if that's the case, then just lengthen the attack time. Now the release, if we have a really excessive release, so let's set to 800 milliseconds, that's almost a second of release. If we do that and just play back really quick.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away.
So you can hear there, the compressor is almost pumping. What that means is that basically one loud word causes the compressor to reduce the gain a bunch. And then because it takes almost a second for the compressor to release, the next word ends up being brought down too. So you kind of hear the compressor bringing the volume back up as it starts releasing, and it ends up affecting subsequent words. So we don't want that, and that's what happens when you have a really excessive release. So I'm actually going to bring this down to about 80 milliseconds, and let's listen to that.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away.
So you can hear now the compressor is reacting just to individual words at a time. So if one word gets brought down, the next word doesn't get excessively brought down. So it gives you a bit of more tight control so you don't get that audible pumping sound of the compressor. So now that we've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the ratio. So our ratio is going to be 1.8, which means our compressor isn't going to reduce the volume a bunch. And then I'm going to bring up my threshold so we're getting about 3 to 5 dB of compression.
There was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit, and he had an axe, and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away no matter what. Like every time I turned around, he was just right there. And he had this axe, and we went up these stairs, and he was right there. And
okay, so you can see this, I should have pointed out, this trace here represents the gain. So
there was this guy,
when it comes down,
maniac.
that means we're reducing the gain. So basically what's going on right now is we're reducing the gain of the loudest words about 5 dB, which is good. What that means is we're just kind of gently compressing everything, not too significant. It's just kind of gently evening everything out. So now our compressor isn't acting too heavily, so it's not going to do all the work of evening out. Now we could add another compressor. For example, you could add a second compressor. You might give it a higher ratio and make it a bit more aggressive, but we're not going to do that. What we're actually going to do is we're going to come to our vocal folder. This folder, this is Reaper terminology. I'm using Reaper here as my DAW. If you use another program, this is probably called a bus. And a bus is basically just a track where you route all of the audio to that track so you can process it all together. So in this case, I have both of my dialogue channels going to one dialogue channel where I can process all of them together. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add this limiter. Now a limiter is a very aggressive compressor that essentially makes sure that nothing goes above a certain level. In this case, we're going to set our peak to negative 2.3. And we'll come back to why that's the case in a second, but we're going to put this again on our vocal bus to make sure none of our dialogue goes above negative 2.3. Now the reason I'm doing this, and we'll come back and we'll actually tune this limiter a bit, but I'm setting it up now because of the stuff that we're going to do for the next couple of minutes will affect the limiter. Essentially, a limiter, like we said, it's a very hard limit. It's going to make sure nothing goes above a specific level. Now that's great. That's what we want. However, the downside of that is that if you push too much sound through the limiter, it will start to distort. So what I want to have this limiter here, and I want to have it present so that if there is any distortion, I can hear that and I can fix it now rather than fiddling with it later on. So Neutron 3, I'm using this. It has a limiter built in. It's not the fanciest limiter. If you have like a dedicated limiting plugin, it might look more like this, Maximizer and Ozone. So you have a ceiling, which is the maximum volume that the sound will hit. You'll have a threshold, and then you might have some other controls. But the reason I'm using Neutron here is because Neutron really conveniently supports surround sound. Now this project right here is only in stereo. However, if we were to remix this project in 5.1, Neutron would be able to act as a 5.1 limiter, which again is really convenient. What we're going to do here is I'm actually going to set this to a clear style because we want it to be very transparent, and then the mode we're going to set to ERC2, which is a limiting algorithm that tends to be very transparent. So we're going to set that. We have a ceiling here. I'm going to get rid of Ozone because we're not actually using that. That was just for demonstration purposes. And then we are going to go through our audio and do some volume automation. Now, volume automation is basically a way of very manually controlling the audio. Our compressor is very automatic. It reacts to sound and brings it down, but it's also it acts on a very micro level. It acts by essentially bringing down the audio at a very small segment of time. We have an attack of 20 milliseconds, a release of 80 milliseconds. That's 0.08 of a second. That's such a short amount of time. So what we want to start looking at is adjustments more on the macro scale. So we're going to do that again manually. Now there are tools out there that can do this. Nectar actually has a automatic level metering tool built in. There's also other tools out there like the Waves Vocal Rider, and there's some Acusonus and other stuff that's out there. I'm not a big fan of them because they tend to be a bit heavy-handed, and they really like to bring up things like breaths and stuff like that really loud. It's really obnoxious. Um, but they do get used. Some dialogue mixers have success with them, but an easier way to do it is just to do it manually. So what we're going to go through is we're actually going to go through and just manually manipulate the volume of the dialogue throughout the entire scene here. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to enable level automation, and this works differently in different DAWs, but on Reaper, we're just going to go to Trim, and we're going to go to Volume Pre-Effects. Now we're going to use the pre-effects volume because we want to adjust the volume of the audio before it hits the compressor. Dialogue mixing is all about being as transparent as possible. We don't want it to be obvious that we're manipulating the audio. So if I was to adjust the post-effects volume, what that would mean is that if there's a really loud segment that's being compressed a lot, and I decide I want to turn it down even more, and then maybe there's a quieter segment that's not being compressed at all, and I decide to raise it up, what we're going to end up with is two segments where the compressor is acting on one, but not on the other part, even though they're both the same volume. And what that means is that you're going to get a bit of the tone of the compressor on one of the segments, but not the other. Compressors can impart a little bit of tone. And I should point out, that's also why we're doing the EQ first. Sometimes, especially in music, you'll EQ after you compress, but for the sake of transparency, we EQ first. Because, for example, you can see we're cutting out the low frequencies. If there was a bunch of low frequency stuff down here, that could be triggering the compressor to react. And if we filter that out after the compressor, now the compressor is reacting to stuff that isn't there, that we can't hear. So we compress first so that the compressor is reacting to what's actually there, what we're actually going to hear, and that makes it as transparent as possible. Again, especially in music mixing, you'll see it done the other way, but typically for dialogue, we EQ first and then compress. And again, we adjust the volume first so that if I say there's this really loud peak right here, I'm just going to add these key points and I'm going to drag it down. Now, this isn't going into the compressor as hard, which means it's going to be a bit more transparent, which is good. That's what we want. So we're going to adjust the pre-effects volume. Now, the other thing you probably just noticed is that when I adjust these key points here, you can actually see the change reflected in the waveform here. That's really convenient because it kind of gives me a reference point to go in here and say, oh, these sections are a bit louder. Let me just bring those down a bit. Now, you don't want to mix visually. You don't want to go in and be like, oh, every single part that's louder or quieter, I'm going to bring up or down. You don't want to do that. You do want to actually listen to it. But the visual cue can be a nice, again, reference point just to kind of gauge where you're at. So this is the really tedious part of dialogue mixing, but what I am going to do now is I'm going to go through and just this whole clip, I'm going to go through, I'm going to listen, I'm going to say, does that sound too quiet, too loud? And then I'm going to adjust this volume here manually based on that. Okay, so you can see I've gone through, I've adjusted the volume here, not my most careful job ever, but it just gives you kind of a picture of what the end result looks like. And you can see the changes I'm making here, like -4 dB, +3, -1, +3. These are really small changes. For most people, 3 dB is kind of the minimum volume change you can hear. Just to give you context, if you take your phone and you press the volume button once, that's about 3 to 4 dB of change. So 3 dB is a really small amount of change. So I'm not making big drastic changes here, but it's just enough to kind of even out, level out the dialogue as a whole, and to make it more consistent. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to bring in a meter, a loudness meter specifically. Now there's a lot of these out there. Ulean is a free one. Insight is the one I'll be using. It is not free, but it is very good. Pull this up. And what this meter does is this meter gives us kind of a picture of the loudness of our dialogue. Now, why is that important? Well, let me pull up here. This is the specifications that Netflix requires of any film or TV show that is uploaded to Netflix. And Netflix conveniently publishes all of this openly and publicly, but Netflix is not the only publisher that has these types of requirements. In fact, pretty much every publisher, whether it's for television, whether it's for a movie theater, whether it's for another streaming service like HBO, all of them have requirements for the technical specifications of the audio, and you have to meet them. Now, dialogue specifically is kind of the key to a lot of these loudness measurements. And you'll see here, Netflix requires negative 27 LKFS plus or minus 2 LU dialogue gated. Peaks must not exceed negative 2 dB. That is a lot to unpack. Now, if you don't understand what LKFS is, I have a whole video on loudness, but again, the short description is it's a way of measuring the volume of something based on what we actually hear. So it takes into account kind of the psychoacoustics of how we perceive audio. So rather than measuring kind of the scientific volume of something, it's measuring closer to the human perception of the volume of something. So negative 27 is our level, plus or minus 2 LU means that we have flexibility. We can be anywhere between negative 29 and negative 25. Negative 27 is our target, but we can be 2 dB above or below that. Dialogue gated, we'll come back to that one actually. Peaks must not exceed negative 2 dB true peak. That's why we set our limiter to negative 2.3. If you actually dig through this a bit more, and I don't remember where it says in here, but Netflix actually recommends if you set a limiter to set it to negative 2.3, just to make sure if any peaks just barely get through your limiter, there's still a bit of safety room to make sure that nothing goes above negative 2 dB. And again, audio should be measured over the full program, so the entire length of whatever you're putting together should be measured. That's referred to as the integrated loudness. Now let's come back to this dialogue gated. What does that mean? Well, if you're familiar with an audio gate is something that cuts out the silent part of something. Dialogue gated is similar to that. Dialogue gated is based on originally a algorithm that was in a Dolby loudness meter. Dolby discontinued that loudness meter, and when they did so, they made this dialogue gating algorithm publicly available. And so a lot of other software developers have implemented dialogue gating into their software. Essentially, it's a system that measures the loudness of something only when it detects dialogue is present. So essentially, this algorithm is designed to detect dialogue, and when it detects dialogue, it starts measuring the loudness. When it doesn't detect dialogue, it doesn't measure anything. Now, it's not perfect. It doesn't perfectly isolate dialogue, but it's pretty good. And the reason why we measure this dialogue loudness is because if you think about it, different types of content are going to be at different volumes. This whole idea of loudness and loudness normalization is that all of our content should be at the same volume. So if I watch a movie and then I flip over and watch a TV show, I don't have to drastically adjust the volume between the two. But something like an action film with a bunch of gunshots and explosions and cars driving everywhere, that's going to be really loud. Whereas something like a romantic comedy, on average, is going to be a lot quieter without all those explosions and gunshots going off. So how do you make that fair? Do you force the romantic comedy to be much louder than it needs to be? Do you force the action movie to turn down all of the action? No, you go off of a consistent reference point, which is dialogue. So essentially, you acknowledge that yes, your action film is going to be louder, but as long as the dialogue is consistent across all content, then it should be pretty even and fair. And that's the idea. So I will just point out, Netflix does go into a bit more detail on dialogue gating, and they actually have a whole blog post explaining dialogue gating and why they chose that and all the research they did to reach that conclusion. But I just wanted to point this out because there's a whole list here. Netflix publishes a list of the loudness meters that you can use. So again, we're using Isotope Insight here. Ulean loudness meter, there's a free version of that. There's also a paid version, but there's a free version, which is really nice if you don't have a loudness meter. Nugen is probably the most popular for really high-end post-production, but you'll also see Waves and the Dolby ones. So there's a lot of different meters out there, but again, we're going to use Insight. The same concept is the same between all of them. So we load up Insight here, and actually Insight has a built-in preset for Netflix. So again, this is going to set a peak level of -2, overall loudness of -27, and dialogue gating. Now, Insight is not doing anything to the audio. Insight does not manipulate the audio in any way. It is only measuring the audio. So what that means is that when we set these targets, essentially it's going to measure here, and if we go above those targets, then it will warn us. Again, it's not going to change the audio. It's just going to tell us, hey, your integrated loudness is too high. You need to turn your dialogue down. That's what it's going to tell us. So what I'm going to go through and do here is I'm just going to play back this whole scene, and we're going to see where we're at in terms of our overall dialogue loudness. Okay, so you can see Insight did not do a very good job of picking up the dialogue there. Our dialogue is actually really quiet. So I'm actually, I'm going to kind of cheat here, and I'm actually just going to lower our ambience a bit, and I'm going to take my two dialogue channels and I'm just going to raise them up a little bit. So hopefully we'll go through again, and hopefully Insight will actually capture our dialogue this time. Okay, so you can see we're actually above our loudness now, raising that up a bit too much. So I'm actually just gonna lower that volume there again. Again, we want to be somewhere between -29 and -25, ideally around 27. So let's just play back again and see if we actually hit that target when I lower that volume down. Okay, so it caught enough of our dialogue there. That's fine. We're at -28, which isn't our target. But let's just say I wanted to be really anal and hit exactly -27. What I can do here is go into my limiter, and I'm actually just going to raise up the input gain by 1 dB. You can see me lowering the DPI of my mouse, so I'm very precise here. I guess we're going to raise it 1.2. But this is what you would do. Maybe you came in way too low with your dialogue. Maybe you came in way too high. You can go in and adjust the gain of your limiter to hit that target overall. So now, hopefully when we go back through, we should hit exactly -27. But again, we have a bit of flexibility, so this would actually be fine. I'm just demonstrating. So again, it didn't get it all the way up to 27 because it changed what sections of dialogue it was measuring a bit when we raised the volume, but it's fine. That's, again, well within the range that we want to be. I'll also point out this loudness range here. Generally, Netflix recommends you keep this under 10 LU. Loudness range refers to how much variation in the audio there is, so the difference between the quieter sections and the louder sections. You could hypothetically kind of cheat the loudness measurement because we're measuring the entire film. For example, you could have one scene that you mix really loudly and then another scene that you mix really quiet to balance it out. That would be a bad idea, but you could hypothetically do that. And Netflix doesn't require you to keep your dialogue within a certain loudness range, but they recommend that you do, and they recommend you keep it under 10. So basically that ensures there's not an excessive amount of variation between different scenes or even within a scene in the level of the dialogue. You want it consistent across the entire film. Now, the last thing I want to point out is that there are other things you can do to kind of help the dialogue poke out a bit more, and that comes down to kind of using the dialogue to bring down other elements. That's referred to as sidechaining. It's also called ducking. Basically, you have it set up so that your dialogue automatically turns down the volume of your ambience, for example. That's a fairly common tool, especially in music, but it is less common in dialogue. It is a valid tool, but generally you're better off just turning down your ambience manually rather than triggering it with a gate. But for some reason you want to, maybe you have a really heavy action scene where there's a lot going down and you do want to duck the background elements to the important dialogue, you can do that. I'm not going to go into how to do that on this video, but I will point out I made a video for this tool called Lol AI, where I go into some of these different methods of ducking and sidechaining background elements to help bring the dialogue out. So I'll just point out, if you want to watch that video, that goes into a bunch of detail on those different techniques that you can use, but generally they're not necessary. Generally you can just turn down the background noise. But in this case, that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back the background noise back to the level I had at the beginning. I'm going to play back now that we have this compression, this limiting, this volume automation. How much did we improve it? So I'll play this back so you can kind of hear that comparison start to finish of how all the things that we did help to make the dialogue stand out.
Hey, I just had the weirdest dream ever. I was in a warehouse and there was this guy, he was a maniac in this yellow suit and he had an axe and he was chasing me, and it was like I just couldn't get away no matter what. Like every time I turned around he was just right there. And he had this axe and we went up these stairs and he was right there, and as soon as I turned around he just tried to get me and then I woke up.
Wow, it's awful. You need this one.
Okay, that's it. That's how to make your dialogue come up out of the background noise, stand out, be easy to understand, and still be totally transparent. So again, that's it for this video. If you like this video, if you learned something useful, hit that like button. If not, feel free to hit the dislike button. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those down in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this one, including an upcoming series where I talk about how to mix dialogue and surround sound 5.1. So if you want to see that, definitely hit that subscribe button.